Ceci nous permettra d'avoir un peu plus de temps pour la situation des droits de l'homme en Afrique, dans la mesure où beaucoup des INDH, beaucoup d'ONG ont des tickets d'avion qui leur permettent de quitter certains déjà vers 19-20 heures ici et d'autres beaucoup plus tard la nuit. Il serait bon que les gens ne rentrent pas sans avoir présenté leur déclaration. Ainsi, je demanderai aux ONG et aux INDH qui sont dans la salle de rester, mais aussi et surtout d'appeler ceux qui ne sont pas là, qui sont encore dans les hôtels, de venir, parce qu'après ça, il ne faudrait plus que les gens disent que la Commission ne nous a pas donné l'occasion de prendre la parole. Nous allons changer pour vous permettre de présenter. Mais avant de faire cela, nous avons un panel sur le lancement des observations générales sur la régulation des acteurs privés intervenant dans la fourniture des services sociaux. Je voudrais inviter tous les panélistes impliqués dans ce panel de bien vouloir prendre place sur le panel. Madame, Mesdemoiselles et Messieurs, nous ouvrons le panel de lancement de l'observation générale numéro 7. Cette observation générale, comme vous le savez, définit et clarifie les obligations de l'État en vertu de la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et du peuple dans le contexte de la fourniture privée des services sociaux. Vous savez que les acteurs privés interviennent dans le secteur des services sociaux pour certaines matières qui sont vitales pour les pays, pour les nations. Il était tout à fait indiqué que les obligations du premier créancier en matière de services sociaux, je cite le gouvernement ou l'État, pris dans son sens le plus large possible, puisse connaître quelles sont ses obligations dans ce domaine, quelles sont les limites, les lignes rouges à ne pas franchir, et il est nécessaire de clarifier les obligations à cet égard. Et dans ce panel, nous aurons l'honorable commissaire Matford de Mwandenga, qu'on ne présente plus, le président du groupe de travail sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, le professeur François Villoun, qui est membre de ce groupe de travail, et nous aurons également Madame Salima Namoussobia, membre également du groupe de travail sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels. Avant de commencer, ou plutôt, permettez-moi, après cette introduction, de passer la parole à l'honorable commissaire Mitford, qui va faire un discours d'ouverture parce que cette observation générale émane du groupe de travail sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels. Honorable Mitford, selon le protocole que vous avez établi, que nous allons suivre, vous avez 5 minutes pour faire votre discours d'ouverture.
Thank you, Chair and Moderator, for this session. And good afternoon. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, partners, and stakeholders in the human rights promotion and protection in Africa. Today's panel is part of the African Commission's commitment to emphasize the common African aspirations towards realizing the Africa we want. Provision of quality social services is very vital in achieving the African Union Agenda 2063 dream of the Africa we want, a continent with a more egalitarian culture founded on good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law, which will be resulting in enjoyment by everyone on the African soil of the rights in the African and international human rights instruments ratified by African states. Ladies and gentlemen, we are aware that several challenges have emanated from states adopting economic policies that encourage relegating the provision of social services to the private sector. In the light of the above issues, the African Commission adopted Resolution 434 on the need to develop norms on states' obligations to regulate private actors in the provision of social services and mandated its working group on economic, social, and cultural rights in Africa to develop norms or soft law standards, including general comments and other instruments that define states' obligation in this domain. On our part as a working group, we settled for the working out of the general comment, and I'm sure Professor Franz is going to delve into the reasons as to why we did that. That said, the General Comment 7 on the state's obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in the context of private provision of social services, which is being launched today, is part of the working group's step towards operationalizing Resolution 434. The general comment, without necessarily delving into the nitty-gritty of it, seeks to elucidate the obligation of the African states to ensure the provision of social services as provided for under Article 13.3 of the African Charter, which guarantees access to public services in strict equality before the law. Article 41 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance, which stipulates that state parties should provide and enable access to basic social services. The AU Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons, which reaffirms that states shall provide internally displaced services, sanitation, education, and any other social services. And the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security. It also seeks distinguished delegates to provide guidance on the interpretation and implementation of the state's obligations to ensure provision of quality and accessible social services to all, regulate all private actors that participate in social provision, and expound the duty incumbent on all private actors to respect human rights in their activities. And lastly, it seeks to provide, to enable and guide states to provide the Commission with comprehensive information on steps taken to fulfill the above mentioned obligations in their reports under Article 62 of the African Charter. Distinguished delegates, you may wish to note that this general comment was actually adopted by the Commission at its 72nd ordinary session, which was held virtually on the 19th July to the 2nd of August 2022. We are here to officially launch the general comment and create awareness on its existence and content among state parties, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and all stakeholders in the human rights terrain. Distinguished delegates, it will be remiss on my part if I do not take cognizance, and unashamedly so, of the support that we received from 5 partners, namely the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, the Dula Oma Institute, University of Western Cape, the Global Initiative of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, the Open Society Foundation, and the Rights to Education Initiative. In this regard, the Commission is extremely grateful to our partners. Thank you, Chair.
Merci beaucoup, commissaire Mwandenga, pour ce discours d'ouverture. Maintenant, je vais passer la parole au professeur France William pour qu'il nous donne une vue d'ensemble et une justification de cette observation générale numéro 7 qui parle des obligations des États dans son contexte, bien évidemment, de fourniture des services sociaux par les acteurs privés. Professeur France, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you also to Commissioner Mwandenga, who gave such able leadership in this process. Ladies and gentlemen, standing on all protocols, I would like in the brief moments I have to make some remarks about the need for the adoption of normative guidance to state parties to the African Charter on the role of non-state actors or private actors in the provision of social services. This need has emerged as challenges to the provision of social services became more apparent over time. One of the most significant challenges was the set of policy reforms introduced by what is commonly referred to as the Washington Consensus. For most of the 1980s and 1990s, governments, private actors, and international financial institutions endorsed a range of political policies that encouraged states to gradually withdraw from social service provision. During this transition, private actors became increasingly involved in the provision of such services that had traditionally been delivered by governments. And steadily, during this transition, we saw that the pursuit of macroeconomic policies, those of liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, saw African policymakers neglect or sometimes fail to comply with their obligation to build and maintain a strong public social service infrastructure. In fact, we saw over the last decades a significant increase in the number of private institutions in African states being involved in the provision of social services, in particular education and healthcare. One of the studies showed that in Ogun State, for example, in Nigeria, private secondary schools attendance outweighed the number of public schools attendance by more than 80%. This gives rise to two scenarios that I'll briefly sketch. On the one hand, we have the scenario where public services are provided, but these services are not accessible to those who really are in need of those services. So, in many instances, the public services that are provided are of an excellent quality, but the inaccessibility to these services exacerbate pre-existing inequalities and deepen social segregation and stratification. This obviously is due to the association with these services to exorbitant costs. And this is so because many private service providers are providing these services not to close the gap that had been created by a lack of access, but certainly rather to make profits off the public. The general comment in this regard emphasizes the responsibility, the obligation of states to provide accessible and quality provision of social services. On the other hand, we often also see that social services that are provided are of an inferior quality. For example, in the context of education, research studies show that sometimes the physical facilities are inadequate, such as one-room apartments being used to provide secondary or primary education, and then certainly that understaffing and underqualified teachers are often also used to save costs. There is also often inadequate regulation in place in legislation and other administrative processes in states. And even when regulation is in place, the research shows that bribery, corruption often occurs in the enforcement, leading to the shortcomings in the provision of public services being overlooked or underreported. In this regard, then, the general comment emphasizes and elaborates on the need for effective regulation to protect the rights of Africa's people against these potential abuses of their rights. My colleague Salima will expand on the specific content, but allow me, Chair, just to make a few remarks also about the status of the general comment. The general comment 7, as other comments, are directed at state parties. However, it is soft law. It is not a new treaty. It does not amend the treaty, but seeks to clarify and to elucidate the treaty provisions of the Charter and other African Union treaties. But even if it is not formally binding in and of itself, a number of factors contribute to making this form of soft law, General Comment 7, very highly persuasive. And I will just briefly want to touch on 5 factors that make the General Comment such a persuasive document. The first factor is the process and its authorization. It is important that the process in terms of which the General Comment's adoption was launched was authorized. It was authorized in the sense that it was conducted by the treaty body of the African Charter, the Commission. It was done in terms of the powers granted to the African Commission under Article 45. It was done in pursuit of elaborating on the African Charter, the treaty that is the substance on which the African Commission works. And lastly, it was done under the power of a resolution, Resolution 434, referred to before, a resolution adopted by the Commission. The second factor is the process. The process should be transparent, inclusive, and consultative for the legitimacy and the authority of the soft law to be established. In this case, despite the challenges of COVID-19, the working group and its technical expert group met numerous times. We involved as a working group and expert group also outside experts, who were given the opportunity to input on aspects of the drafts, and later the draft was placed on the Commission's website for comments. These comments were incorporated, and the working group was fortunate to meet in person and incorporate and discuss all these changes. So the issue of inclusive and consultative process, I think, has been met just as the first of authorization. The third factor, Chair, is that the eventual output should be of a substantive quality. It should engage the primary and secondary texts on which the work is based. In this instance, the drafters certainly looked at the relevant primary text, the treaties. It looked at the secondary documents such as all the other general comments of the African Commission, its jurisprudence, and many other guidelines. In fact, if you have the general comment in hand, you will see that there are endnotes. There are 144 endnotes to also substantiate the exposition of the law that is set out in this general comment. The fourth factor is that the soft law standard would be hardened, if you like, if it fills a particular normative gap. And we tried to make the argument before, but one is also aware that there had been in place the guiding principles, the Abidjan principles on human rights obligations of states to provide public education, to regulate private involvement in education. So there is, though, a very clear distinction between this General Comment 7 and the Abidjan principles. The first is that the Abidjan principles were adopted by experts outside the framework of any intergovernmental organization. Clearly this is different here with the authorization of the African Commission within the ambit of the African Union being in place, which qualitatively makes a big difference. Secondly, the Abidjan principles clearly only focus on the right to education, whereas General Comment 7 endeavors to have a much broader focus. The last factor, Chair, is that really of the post-adoption use of the General Comment. Now that is really a matter of the future, for the future, that will determine ultimately how the legitimacy and the authority of this document is established. But I would suggest that it depends on states. The main obligation of states should be to adopt legislation, to review legislation, to ensure that proper regulatory frameworks are put in place, and that they report when they submit state reports on the efforts made in this regard. Civil society should be disseminating and raising awareness about these General Comment provisions as far as can be done. Academics should write commentaries and record examples of the use of the General Comment. And the Commission itself, in the last place, should certainly integrate the General Comment to the extent possible in its working methods, and particularly integrate it into the way in which guidance is given in terms of state reporting as required under Article 62 of the Charter. Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to make these remarks.
Merci beaucoup, professeur François Lyoun. Nous allons passer à la dernière intervenante, Madame Salima, qui va nous parler de l'obligation de l'État de réglementer ses acteurs privés dans ce domaine contesté de fourniture de services sociaux. Madame Salima, vous avez 15 minutes. 15 minutes, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, commissioners, representatives of states, representatives of national human rights institutions, other participants on protocol observed, ladies and gentlemen. I would want to also follow the previous speakers in thanking all the people who were participating in the drafting of the General Comment to get us to this point where we are now launching it. I'm going to give a snapshot of the General Comment, and essentially highlights the key points that the general comment elaborates. Like it was said earlier, it is not new law, it simply interprets existing law, specifically interpreting what has been said before, and most importantly, interpreting the Charter. Now, the general comment is divided into 7 sections. I will not go through all of them. First, I will look at Section B, which has the general human rights standards applicable to social service provision. And in there is a restatement of many of the obligations that we know, but just to highlight a few provisions in there, is that first of all, under paragraph 11, the general comment records the non-commercial character of social services. And it notes that the current trend of marketization, commercialization, or commodification of social services like health, education, is against, it undermines the objects of the Charter, to the extent that it doesn't allow for people who need social services to have them, and yet these social services are supposed to be public goods that are accessible to everybody regardless of their ability to pay for the services. With that in mind, the general comment therefore requires states to impose public service obligations on all the private providers who are involved in social service provision. And this is premised on the fact that when a private actor participates in social service provision, it exercises a core function that necessitates a high level of protection of the collective public interest. So at all times, that public interest must be protected. And some of the social service obligations that are to be imposed by the states include the fact that social services should be available to all individuals on an equal basis and without discrimination, and also the fact that these social services must be available also in times of emergency. Then Section C looks at the state obligation to ensure the provision of public social services. And basically this is premised on the fact that the Charter, written around the entire Charter, is the concept of human dignity. So the state obligations to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights require states to ensure an effective system for the provision of quality social services. And in here, the general comment recognizes that even if the states do have a discretion to develop their own systems of social service provision, there must always be a public option that is adequately funded, that is democratically controlled, and non-commercial in nature. But also there is, the general comment reminds the states that they do have an obligation to provide quality public services in certain circumstances, and examples are given in there. For example, in relation to education, where states are required to provide primary education services as a core obligation. Then the other obligation of the states that is recalled by the general comment is the obligation to fund public services. And the general comment recognizes that provision of public services is dependent upon sufficient resources being mobilized, allocated, and spent in an accountable, effective, efficient, equitable, participatory, transparent, and sustainable manner, and enjoin states to engage in progressive taxation and engage in activities like curbing of illicit financial flows in order to increase their domestic resource mobilization. And this obligation of funding also extends to the context where the states require local governments, where there is devolution of government, and the general comment reminds states that under such circumstances, the financing that goes to the local governments should also be adequate enough to facilitate their ability to be able to provide social services. Then under section D, the general comment looks at the state obligation to regulate private provision. And this section is anchored on the state obligation to protect and requires that states adopt administrative, legislative, investigative, adjudicatory and other measures in order to effectively regulate private providers. And it also requires that the state has an obligation to put in place regulatory standards that are clear, that are precise, that are comprehensive, in order to ensure that the regulation is effective. There's a lot of detail there that I'm not going through that people should look at in order to see what the general comment elaborates in terms of private provision. Then the general comment also looks at situations of delegation of resources, and this is in recognition of the fact that sometimes states may delegate provision of social services, for example, under conditions, under arrangements of public-private partnerships. And under these circumstances, the general comment, first of all, indicates that states are under no obligation to delegate resources to private social service providers. So it is not mandatory for the states to actually engage in delegation. It should be in situations that again are elaborated under the general comment, and also the general comment puts forward substantive, procedural and operational requirements to be followed by the states in the delegation of social service delivery. But most importantly, under this section, the general comment also puts in place conditions conditions under which this delegation should be happening, and gives the requirements for the private actors that would be eligible to receive the financing. The states should ensure that private actors receiving state funds make all proprietary data and material that could help to improve public social services system available without getting into requirements of maybe the state having a license or other requirements like that. And it also elaborates private actors that should not be getting state resources for purposes of delegation of public services, for example, under public-private partnerships. For example, states must not fund or support directly or indirectly private actors that abuse the rights to equality and non-discrimination, including, for example, by being selective or expelling or sorting rights holders, whether directly or indirectly on the basis of their socio-economic status or any other prohibited ground. But also the general comment reminds states that they should not be engaging with private actors that are commercial and excessively pursue personal interest, for example, profit at the expense of the public interest. Then under section F, the general comment has human rights consequences for actors other than non-state actors, for actors other than states, that is the non-state actors, for example, private actors and intergovernmental organizations. And this is in recognition of the fact that the African Charter does actually spell out duties for non-state actors, and therefore they should be able to be mindful of that fact. And the general comment recalls Articles 27, 28, 29 of the African Charter, and recalls duties, for example, around payment of tax and respect for rights of others, but also mandatory human rights due diligence. Lastly, under Section G, there's the reporting obligations. The general comment calls upon states to ensure that they provide relevant information on the implementation of social services under their jurisdiction in accordance with this particular general comment. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention et surtout pour le petit temps que vous nous donnez en bonus pour nous permettre d'aller un peu plus rapidement encore dans ce panel. Je voudrais demander, on va ouvrir maintenant des échanges interactifs pour 25 minutes. Est-ce qu'il y a un délégué des États qui souhaite intervenir? L'Égypte a soulevé la pancarte. Mais je signale que pour tout ça, il ne reste que 25 minutes pour terminer avec ce panel. Ambassadeur, Excellence, Monsieur l'ambassadeur Atia, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and I'd like to thank the panelists for what we've heard today and the presentation that we've had. The general comment is definitely a step forward from our point of view. It shows that the Commission is becoming more and more focused on issues related to economic, social, and cultural rights, as should be, because these are things that touch the lives of people in our countries at the core. And it is important that we see that the Commission is responsive to the needs of our people as prioritized by them, by the people themselves and their governments. So I thank you for that and for this important general comment. I'd like to take this opportunity to maybe make a quick briefing on the way that we in Egypt have actually been trying to implement some measures that go in line with what is in the general comment. Very quickly, I would say that back in 2007, the population of Egypt was about 70 million people. By that time, the government apparatus consisted of 7 million people who were working for the government. Today, we have a population of 104 million people, with a government apparatus of only 5 million. So the government apparatus has shrinked while the population has grown, and it will continue to grow, of course. With a fertility rate in the country of 2.7%, I think it's going to continue to grow. I don't know to where, but it will. So the government at the same time is planning to bring down the number of those who are working for it from 5 million today to 3.5 million. But as I said, the population will continue to grow. So how would that be possible that the government, with a growing population and of course growing needs of the population, will be able to respond to those needs and to provide the public services that it needs to provide? Only or unless the government cooperates fully with the civil society. So this is a strategic point of view of our government, is that it's only that we will be able to increase our ability to make services available to people, not only in urban areas, but also in suburban as well as remote areas. And I think this is the case in many African countries, that the government, the central government, does not have that accessibility, that much accessibility to reach people in remote areas, as would the civil society. So I think that kind of partnership is very important for, at least for our government, and I think it is for many in our continent, that we will embark on that. So I applaud you for this general comment. I think it comes at the right moment, and it does give added stamina to the partnership that should exist between governments in Africa and civil society. I would only want to end by maybe asking a question because I didn't have a chance to read the general comment, and I only depended on what I heard today. And I'm not sure if the general comment has room for corporate responsibility in a way that would actually incorporate the private businesses and their work also for the benefit of the provision of public services to the people and to support the work that is being done by governments as well as civil society. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Lorsque nous étions à Sharm el-Sheikh, le président El-Sisi nous avait invités de visiter justement les services sociaux de base en Égypte, mais notre agenda ne nous avait pas permis de faire ce petit tour. On espère que prochainement, lorsqu'on sera en Égypte, et s'il nous reçoit encore, nous allons lui rappeler qu'il nous doit encore une visite qu'il nous avait gracieusement offerte pour qu'on aille voir les réalisations économiques de l'Égypte. Je le dis parce qu'on était là avec d'autres commissaires qui ne sont plus là, mais la vice-présidente qui était là avec moi, elle s'en souviendra bien. Merci beaucoup. Y a-t-il encore un État qui souhaite prendre la parole? Sinon, je vais donner la parole à ceux qui s'étaient inscrits sur la liste. Je donne la parole à Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, GIESCR, avec un numéro d'observateur 459, Lou Aya. Vous êtes là? Érythrée, hein? Ah, ok. À l'instant, je suspends la parole que je vous ai donnée en accordant la parole à l'Érythrée.
Thank you, Chair, for giving us the floor. And I applaud and commend all the panelists for their very eloquent presentations. So this issue is a very serious issue for us because education, and especially education and health services, are a very basic human rights. And we think the government have primary responsibility to provide these services. Of course, the private sector can play its part, but basically there is the issue of budget. Who funds those private sectors or this civil society to provide this service? Because it costs a lot to provide education and health service to the population, especially to people living in rural areas. And we need a delicate balance between the government and the civil society or the private sector. What I mean is the private sector cannot act or cannot be substituting the government's role. So it is sensitive. I think it is easy to say, but in practice it is a very complicated and very sensitive and a very difficult job to do. So we need a delicate balance between the government and the private sector. This is one. And second comment is and following the rules and regulations and the policies of a specific government. For example, there is education policy, curriculum, and health services. So how does those funded by the private sector apply or follow these rules and regulations or policies of the government? Does they contradict the government's basic policies, principles? In that case, if that happens, then it is not good for the social fabric of the society. It creates polarization, a vertical polarization of the society. So I think this is a very sensitive issue and we need a delicate balance between those actors. This is my comment and thank you.
Merci beaucoup, on a pris bonne note. J'appelle alors maintenant Global Initiative. Est-ce qu'ils sont dans la salle pour cette question? Vous avez 2 minutes maximum parce qu'il nous reste pour ce débat 15 minutes. Les panélistes doivent aussi conclure. 2 minutes.
Your Excellencies, Honorable Chairperson, Honorable Commissioners, we commend the African Commission on Human Rights.
Parlez un peu plus fort, disent les interprètes. Plus fort.
Your Excellencies, Honorable Chairperson, Honorable Commissioners, we commend
Manifestement, le micro ne fonctionne pas. Essayez de changer de place. Essayez de changer de place. She's not speaking loud. The mic is good.
No, the mic is not good.
check.
You see, the table it's good.
Permettez-lui d'aller sur une table alors.
Yeah, use the table.
Tu peux aller sur une table, madame. Malheureusement, il n'y a que les tables des États, mais exceptionnellement, on va vous y admettre. Très exceptionnellement.
Check.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Honorable Chairperson, Honorable Commissioners, we commend the African Commission on Human and People's Rights for the adoption of General Comment 7 on state obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in the context of private provision of social services. In this general comment, the African Commission has led the way for other regional human rights bodies and the United Nations by providing the most comprehensive interpretation of state obligations under the human rights law regarding social services and their intrinsic connection to the enjoyment of rights, especially economic, social, and cultural rights. We welcome in particular the general comment's emphasis on the non-commercial nature of social services and elaborate guidance on the state obligation to directly provide and adequately fund social services, and the obligation to effectively regulate any private provision of social services to ensure that these actors prioritize the public interest rather than private or commercial interests. It is also commendable that the general comment provides detailed safeguards for the delegation of public resources to support private actors involved in social service provision through substantive, procedural, and operational preconditions. This general comment is a decisive response to the growing and well-documented human rights concerns that arose from the rapid privatization and commercialization of social services in Africa in the last 2 decades. Lack of access to services, systemic discrimination and stratification within societies, inadequate quality, violations of labor rights, and lack of accountability are some of the challenges that arose from the commercialization of social services.
Merci, merci. Je pensais que vous alliez poser la question. Vous êtes vous-même en train de faire œuvre des panélistes. On va maintenant donner la parole au Center for Reproductive Rights, Betty Kabari. Betty Kabari. Betty Kabari, Center for Reproductive Rights. Et pendant on passe, je vais passer à Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Et là, c'est Achila Choumi. C'est vous. On vous a inscrit 2 fois. Il y avait Betty Kabari, et puis il y avait Lou Haya, et puis maintenant c'est Atsuma. Où est Lou? Vous êtes inscrit 2 fois. Ok, il n'y a pas de problème, vous avez déjà parlé, c'est bon. Maintenant, on va passer à l'Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Initiative. Oui, vous avez 2 minutes pour faire pour poser votre question. Ce n'est pas une déclaration, mais une question au panéliste. Vous pouvez y aller. 2 minutes. Il faut négocier. Hein?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. My concern and also message to the African Commission is around dissemination of the general comment because of the impact we saw during the COVID-19, where private actors were profiteering of a pandemic. We saw violation of health rights, education rights, and limiting access. So This general comment, we feel that it is timely because it is an inspiration to states, for example, Uganda, where through the Ministry of Education, there are steps being taken to regulate private actors in education by coming up with a policy on regulation of private actors in education. So we do have faith in this general comment, and we are asking the African Commission to be able to disseminate this general comment and work with states on its implementation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons terminé avec toutes les listes. Est-ce qu'il y a une INDH qui souhaite intervenir sur cette question? Non? Il n'y a pas. Je vais me tourner vers les panélistes dans les 10 minutes qui restent. Si chacun d'entre eux peut prendre 2 minutes, et on va conclure et lancer cette observation générale numéro 7. Je commence par le professeur France, ensuite ce sera madame et on finira par le président du groupe de travail Mwandenga. Professeur France.
Thank you very much, Chair. Maybe just, I think the state representatives alluded to the issue of balance and also rural communities that may be left out or where private actors may be better suited to serve those. I think I can do no better than maybe cite and refer to the general comment itself in paragraph 13 if one has it at hand. The general comment obviously prioritizes the obligation of the state to provide these services. But it does allow and says, however, private provision need not necessarily result in the commercialization of social services, because clearly that is the fear that when it is privatized, it is done for profit purposes rather than for the good of the people. But it emphasizes that the regulation that the state then has to put in place has to ensure that the same standards that would be in place if the state were providing the services would also be guaranteed to be provided when the private actors provide these services. So the regulation should be effective and comprehensive, and I think that is the kind of mainstay of the general comment in many ways, is to emphasize that once there is regulation or once there is some form of allowance for private actors, that the role of the state becomes very important. And the general comment emphasizes democratically controlled non-commercial private actors. And it uses the example, for example, in rural communities where community-based water management systems have been effective short-term solutions for the realization of the right to water. So clearly it prioritizes the obligation of the state, and then if it is privatized, that it should be democratically controlled non-commercial private actors, and if it goes beyond that, the primary obligation of the state is certainly to ensure that the regulation is in place so that the same quality and the same access is available even if private actors provide these services. Thank you very much, Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur France. Madame, vous avez la parole.
Okay, thank you. Also, just to add to what Professor France has said, there was a question around whether there is room for corporate social responsibility. Definitely, like we said earlier, the general comment allows for private actor activity, but there is emphasis on non-commercialization of these activities, and also emphasis on the fact that the state retains the primary responsibility of provision of social services. So in situations where private actors do come in, the state must at all times ensure that their activity does not go against the objectives of the Charter in terms of fulfilling economic, social, and cultural rights. And there was also a question around who funds the private sector. Again, the general comment says the states do not have an obligation to fund the private sector. And also, yes, private actors can come, but even if they come with their money, they cannot commercialize because these services are public goods that should be accessible by all. So where they also come with their money, they have to know that they are operating for the greater good by the fact that they are coming in to offer these social services. So whatever they do, they have to ensure that people still do have access. And then there's conditions that are put down for criteria for when the state may actually fund private sector in situations where they make the justification that funding the private sector to provide that service is the only way out. That is the circumstances that they can use to bring in the private sector, but it has to be time-bound, it has to be justified, and again, all the other criteria of ensuring that the private sector the state is dealing with is not pursuing commercial interests is something that needs to be taken into account to ensure that public funds are not used for profit purposes of the private entity.
Merci beaucoup. Avant que le commissaire Mwandenga ne puisse conclure, j'avais oublié la liste des commissaires. Je donne la parole au commissaire Derso, qui était ancien président du groupe sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, pour un petit commentaire sur cette observation générale. Commissaire Betty.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to, first of all, express my gratitude and appreciation to the working group and the team who did a very fabulous job in putting together the general comment. And I fully share the sentiment that has been expressed about the strategic importance of this general comment. First, in affirming in no uncertain terms the nature and scope of obligations that socioeconomic rights give rise to, and who bears these obligations. Primarily, it is the responsibility of states. That is what human rights require, all right? And what do these obligations entail on the state? That is what this general comment tries to specify as far as socioeconomic rights are concerned. That the state is the one that needs to put in place policies, legislation, institutions, and resources necessary for ever incrementally delivering both in terms of access. So if there are sections of the society without access, they need to have access, but also to improve quality. And two mischiefs that it tries to address are, one, obviously, the question of ensuring access and doing so fulfilling certain minimum criteria as set out in this general comment. The second is, even for those who may think that they can have access to these services from their pocket, then what it does is it also protects them because it puts minimum requirement in terms of the delivery of those services even by the private sector. But the fundamental importance of what it does to me is public services or social services are a public good for which the state should be responsible, and commodification of these services is contrary to the fundamentals of the African Charter and indeed the human dignity on which this general comment is founded. And I can assure you that we are not preaching socialism. And this is actually what the African Charter requires. And I can also assure you that we are not against the private sector. All right? The private sector can't and shouldn't displace the role and responsibility of the state in ensuring access to social services which are fundamental to our dignity and to a life of dignity worthy of a human being. Thank you very much.
Merci, commissaire Derso, pour votre commentaire. Je vais passer maintenant la parole au commissaire Mwandenga pour le mot de la fin avant qu'on puisse procéder au lancement.
Thank you, Chair and Moderator of this session. I am very elated by the comments which the panelists have said, as well as the remarks by Commissioner Deso, who incidentally is also part and parcel of this working group. I adopt their comments without reservation. Now, there was a challenge which was thrown to us as a commission by the last speaker from the floor, which was calling upon the commission to disseminate this general comment. Well, be rest assured that the commission, being the initiators of this general comment, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that we disseminate this general comment. Because if we're not going to do that, then all the efforts by the Commission itself, which started the entire project, if I may call it that, and the experts and the other stakeholders who have made it possible for this general comment to be brought before this august gathering, will be all in vain. And we do not intend to fail in that particular regard. It is our project, it is our baby. We intend to ensure that this document is made use of by the state parties themselves, by the NHRIs who are here, the CSOs, as well as any other stakeholders, and indeed the general public in Africa. And on that score, I'm also throwing a challenge to those of you that are here, the state parties, NHRIs, CSOs, and indeed other stakeholders who are present. You are privileged to be here today as we launch this very important document. So, for me, I put it to you that you've also got a responsibility to ensure that this document and the contents of this document are also disseminated. This document is not only for us, but it's also for the state parties, NHRIs, CSOs. So the challenge is equally thrown to all of us that are here and all the people that are going to hear about this, who are going to read about it. Let's make use of this particular document. Chair, from the comments which have been passed, I'm certain that the general comment is fit material for launching. Thank you.
Nous remercions tous les panélistes et tous les intervenants, les États, les organisations de la société civile et les INDH, et aussi les commissaires qui ont pu apporter leur concours. Il y a un point commun qui résulte de tout ça, c'est que cette observation générale arrive à point nommé, au moment où on en avait le plus besoin, qu'il faut le disséminer, et je vais ajouter même qu'il faut le traduire dans toutes les langues de l'Union africaine pour que cette dissémination soit utile, vu que l'Afrique elle est multilingue. Voici venu maintenant le moment de lancer ce bébé, comme a dit le commissaire Mwandenga, et conformément à nos usages, nous le présentons au public en soulevant les documents pour que tout le monde puisse savoir que voilà, nous avons une autre soft law, commentaire général numéro 7 de la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples déjà adopté, que nous lançons aujourd'hui. Nous promettons qu'il sera traduit dans toutes les langues, l'arabe, le français, le portugais, l'espagnol, le swahili, et qu'il sera surtout disséminé partout. Merci beaucoup à vous tous. Si nous pouvons applaudir ces excellents panélistes pour les encourager. Merci. Nous avons terminé donc avec ce panel et nous ouvrons le point sur la situation des droits de l'homme sur le continent. Avec l'aide de la Providence, nous espérons que tous ceux qui étaient inscrits pourraient présenter. Je vais, parce que c'est une obligation, demander s'il y a d'abord un État, même si je n'ai pas la liste, s'il y a un État qui n'a pas encore fait une déclaration. Je regarde, je ne vois absolument rien, mais s'il y a un État qui arrive en retard, qu'il veuille bien se signaler, nous allons suspendre et retourner la parole aux États pour continuer. Je commence avec les INDH et très rapidement, chaque INDH aura, dans l'intérêt du temps, et vu le nombre élevé qu'il y a, on est obligé de restreindre. On a supprimé un point qu'on avait à l'ordre du jour pour permettre à tout le monde de prendre la parole. Vous avez une motion d'ordre? Je n'ai encore appelé personne. Je n'ai encore appelé personne. Je suis juste en train d'introduire. Si c'est une motion, je vous donne la parole, mais je ne pense pas que ce soit une motion. Laissez-moi suivre ma liste et je pense que tout le monde sera satisfait. Je voudrais que tous les autres intervenants que nous avons puissent avoir 3 minutes parce que la liste elle est très longue. Elle est vraiment longue. Je vais commencer par Kenya National Human Rights Commission, Roseline O.E.D. Chairperson. Vous avez 3 minutes pour faire la déclaration. Est-ce qu'il est là? C'est la dame. Ok, 3 minutes, madame.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson, honorable members of the Commission, representatives from state parties, national human rights institutions, civil society educations, and all distinguished guests. Greetings from the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. My name is Roseline Odede, the chairperson of that commission. I'm pleased to make this statement, and I thank you. Our statement focuses mainly on our general elections held in August to September of this year. And we are glad to report that this time it was a fairly peaceful process with very few violations of human rights. The IEBC, the Electoral Commission, was able to put in systems that ensured more transparency, especially the public results portal. Kenyans exercised tolerance and restraint and avoided violence, which was a significant change and testimony to the peace treaties that were signed across political parties. Those who are dissatisfied were able to access the Supreme Court and were satisfied with the outcome. Our security agencies really obeyed the rule of law and acted in a very professional, humane, and responsive manner. People with disabilities, special interest groups came out in larger numbers this time to participate in the election, which again was a credit. And therefore we say the elections were fairly peaceful. But we noticed a few human rights concerns. Even though the number of those who lost their lives dropped, we still had 11 deaths vis-a-vis 79 in 2017. We had cases of security in certain counties, and this led to reduced political participation in those particular counties, and this was not desirable. We noticed an increased and marked a number of attacks on officials of the election body, and this therefore affected the credibility of the election. Misuse of freedom of expression was also experienced, especially on online platforms, and these mainly targeted women and women candidates, and this was deplorable. Women's political participation dropped in this election. Very few aspirants were women as compared to 2017, and this is something that needs to be looked into. We found instances where the campaigns affected the right to education. We actually recorded 163 cases of disruption of learning, and again, this is an issue that we highlight in our reports. We found polling stations that were not sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities, people with hearing and sight challenges, the rights of the elderly, pregnant mothers, and mothers with children. And again, these are issues we highlight in our report. Outside of the elections, we wish to highlight the issues of food security. East Africa is going through its worst drought ever, and the right to food and water, food security is affected. And we record that 942,000 children aged between 6 to 59 months are experiencing acute malnutrition in 23 arid and semi-arid counties. 2 of these counties are in the alarm phase of drought, 10 are in the alert phase, and 3 are in the normal drought phase. And this is data from the government that we are citing. We are also experiencing rising inflation, which again is affecting human rights.
Thank you.
Especially the rights to food, shelter, and education. Our recommendations, if you let me wind up, our recommendations, 1, for the government to improve its capacity
Thank you.
itself.
Thank you.
1 minute, sir.
Time is over. You must consult your watch.
I could just run through 2 recommendations.
Please help us, please.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Dr. Elastro Hilarius Mugwadi, Chairperson, Zimbabwe National Human Rights Commission. Zimbabwe National Human Rights Commission.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. I, with all due respect, would have loved to be treated fairly in respect of the right to equality and non-discrimination. In other words, be granted the 7 minutes which was granted our colleagues yesterday. But being aware of time constraints, I am required to discuss the topic of positive and negative human rights developments in Zimbabwe from May to September 2022. A summary of the human rights developments impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Zimbabwe continues to experience a decline of the coronavirus cases, resulting in the easing of various restrictions. The vaccination program, which began in February 2021, is continuing and has been extended to children 12 years and above. COVID-19 vaccination, together with the continued adherence to preventative and containment measures, have generally enabled the country to resume economic activities which had been locked down. The right to education, which had been adversely affected by the COVID restrictions, is now being enjoyed by many of the Zimbabwean population. Public examinations this year started in November and they will not spill over to the following year as was experienced in the past 2 years. Government is in action with the treaty and the charter-based mechanisms. My commission, with appreciation, has noted government's commitment to participating and cooperating with various treaty and charter-based mechanisms. The country participated in the 3rd cycle of the Universal Periodic Review process, following participation in the 1st and 2nd cycles. The government also appeared before the Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, said in August 2022, following submission of its 5th to 11th periodic reports. This was a welcome development, as the last report had been submitted in 2011. The Commission continues to encourage the country to clear all outstanding state party reports. There were also gains in civil and political rights. My commission conducted a national inquiry on access to national documentation and discovered that many citizens without identity cards could not access such rights as the right to health, education, employment, social services, voting and freedom of movement.
Thank you very well.
Is my 3 minutes over?
Can you conclude, please? Conclude one sentence.
Well, in conclusion, Honorable Chairperson, my commission has made various recommendations to government to address incidences of politically motivated violence, hate speech and intolerance ahead of the 2023 harmonized general elections.
Thank you. Thank you. ACHPR National Human Rights Commission, Mrs. Albab Tesfaye, 3 minutes. Albab, please take the floor.
Honorable Commissioner, I will be the one presenting, Rakev Mesele, the Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Due to the restricted time, I will focus on the positive and concerning issues. Honorable Commissioner, Chairperson of the African Commission, Honorable Commissioner Mwadenga, Country Rapporteur of Ethiopia, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. The following are some of the key positive developments during the reporting period. The budget allocation for the reconstruction of war-torn schools, hospitals and other essential facilities is a positive development in Ethiopia, but there are concerns that renewed hostilities in northern Ethiopia could halt reconstruction and causes further destruction. The call for inputs of the draft comprehensive disability law that is in the process is a positive step, but there is concern about delays and limited transparency in the promulgation process. The establishment of a commission to investigate past human rights violations that occurred in the Somali region is a positive step, and there have been some measures to provide compensation to victims of human rights violations in Somali and Oromia regions. However, such measures should be expanded to include all other victims of violation. Honorable Chairperson, following are some of the concerning developments during the reporting period. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is deeply concerned about renewed hostilities in the northern Ethiopia since 23 August 2022, after several months of ceasefire. Since the start of the conflict in November 2020, the Ethiopian Commission has first-hand documented its grave impact on the civilian population, including trauma, loss of loved ones and livelihood, and lack of access to essential services. Armed conflict and instability in other regions have also caused serious human rights violations, including killings by state and non-state actors, excessive use of force by security forces, restriction of movement and lack of access to justice. The gendered risk of conflict and violence has continued, exacerbating the precarious situation of women and girls in crisis. Due to conflict and insecurity, over 4 million IDPs depend on humanitarian assistance. Many women and children are exposed to various forms of violence and discrimination in IDP sites, particularly due to lack of gender and age-specific services. The Ethiopian Commission is concerned about repeated incidents of unlawful detention of journalists, opposition party members and activists. The arrest of media personnel was generally contrary to media law. Holding suspect in custody despite a court order for their release has also been observed. The Ethiopian Commission is also concerned that annual inflation remains high in Ethiopia, hindering access to food for large segment of the population. Honorable Chairperson, in view of the identified concern, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission presents the following recommendation to the African Commission.
Please conclude. You are at the end of your time, please, Madam.
Okay, so it's just a recommendation. Yeah. 1, support initiative for the peaceful resolution of the conflict in northern Ethiopia and national efforts to adopt a transitional justice framework. 2, urge parties to the conflict in northern Ethiopia to accept and implement the recommendation of the joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and ACHRC. 3, the Special Rapporteur on Refugees, Asylum Seekers, IDPs and Migrants in Africa to engage with Ethiopia on measures to mitigate displacement crisis and work toward durable solution. 4, urge the Ethiopian government to release unlawfully detained political party members and media personnel. 5, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa to engage with the Ethiopian government to comply with international and regional...
Thank you, Madam.
Sorry?
We'll greet the President, Daniel Bekele, from my side when you'll go back home. Thank you very much for your declaration. Commissioner Mwandenga has very well followed your statement. We follow up. Let me call now Cameroon National Human Rights Commission, Professeur James Mwangwe Kobila, the chairperson. Est-ce qu'il est là? La Commission nationale des droits de l'homme du Cameroun. Il n'est pas présent, nous sautons. Nous allons appeler the Democratic Republic of Congo National Human Rights Commission. Ndonige Nzinga will present on behalf of the chairperson, Mushikonke.
Monsieur le Président, honorables membres de la composition, honorables commissaires, la CNDH-RDC a noté quelques avancées sur les droits civils et politiques, droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, droits collectifs, mais les faits préoccupants demeurent très importants en RDC. S'agissant des droits civils et politiques, nous avons noté comme avancées les métiers de la stabilité des institutions. Nous avons noté comme liberté d'expression, notamment garantie aux opposants. Concernant les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, la CNDH salue l'élaboration par le gouvernement congolais des cadres de budget à moyen terme 2022 qui dégagerait des ressources supplémentaires pour financer les investissements dans les secteurs agriculture, l'éducation, la santé et les infrastructures, notamment l'amélioration des conditions des agents publics de l'État en alignant 1474 médecins et 3000 infirmiers pour les primes des risques. Concernant les droits collectifs, nous avons eu comme avancée l'élection des 4 femmes gouverneurs des provinces, l'adoption de la loi modifiant la loi électorale en insérant l'article 13 qui encouragera et exempte de caution aux listes et qui allierait 50% des femmes candidates. Mais en cela, la CNDH note et demeure préoccupée par rapport aux situations des droits de l'homme qui demeurent très préoccupantes, c'est-à-dire la RDC, dans les secteurs de la vie, notamment en ce qui concerne la sécurité du Nord Kivu et du Ituri, occasionnés par la présence des groupes armés, les tueries à la suite des conflits interethniques dans les provinces de Mai-Ndombe, la crise alimentaire causée par les déplacements massifs de la suite de l'agression de la RDC par le Rwanda, à travers son soutien aux rebelles du M23. Malgré cela, la CNDH-RDC recommande au gouvernement de l'État congolais d'intensifier les actions de maintien de l'ordre public, de rétablissement de la paix dans les provinces de l'Ituri, de Mai-Ndombe, du Nord Kivu, et lutter contre la corruption et les impunités des auteurs de violations des droits de l'homme, tout en intégrant l'approche basée sur les droits de l'homme à l'exécution du programme national politique de la République démocratique du Congo. En ce qui concerne les droits de la femme, la CNDH continue à implorer au gouvernement congolais de respecter son engagement vis-à-vis de ses progrès. Concernant la promulgation de la loi du 3 mai portant protection et promotion des droits des personnes avec handicapés, le dépôt du rapport initial de la RDC au Comité des droits de l'homme, au Comité des droits des personnes avec handicapés, la CNDH-RDC continue à saluer le gouvernement congolais pour l'amélioration et la réintégration des cadres et agents de l'administration publique qui étaient partis en retraite prématurément. L'opérationnalisation de l'établissement lié à la couverture de santé universelle et la décision du gouvernement congolais pour geler la TVA pour faire face aux flambées des produits pétroliers depuis la guerre des ruisseaux ukrainiens afin de soutenir les ménages. Et nous avons dit, nous vous remercions.
Merci beaucoup. Accent. Let me call now Mali National Human Rights Commission, Monsieur Agibou Bouare, the chairperson. La Commission nationale des droits de l'homme du Mali. Vous avez 3 minutes pour faire votre déclaration.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Honorable commissaire, la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme du Mali va se prêter à cet exercice très difficile en 3 minutes. Nous allons commencer par le résumé des développements positifs en matière de droits de l'homme, conformément au plan qui nous a été soumis. Des progrès ont été réalisés, notamment le respect du mandat de l'INDH du Mali par les autorités. Vous savez que le Mali est en période de transition politique, c'est un acquis. Il y a également la bonne collaboration entre l'INDH et les institutions de l'État, notamment certains ministères clés, ministère de la Justice, de la Sécurité et de la Défense. La poursuite des actions et efforts de sécurisation des populations s'est fait dans le contexte de lutte contre le terrorisme. Il y a également une multiplication des sessions de renforcement de capacité au profit des forces de défense et de sécurité en droit de l'homme et en droit international humanitaire. Il y a l'adoption d'un chronogramme de retour à l'ordre constitutionnel et sa mise en œuvre progressive. Il y a eu la tenue d'un atelier national sur la validation des avant-projets de loi portant code pénal et code de procédure pénale qui vise à criminaliser la pratique de l'esclavage par ascendance. Au chapitre des développements négatifs en matière de droits de l'homme, nous pouvons noter la persistance de l'esclavage par ascendance au Mali, notamment dans la région des Cailles, la liberté de la presse qui est en difficulté. Au constat, certains journalistes, hommes et femmes de médias pratiquent l'autocensure, des craintes de représailles. La CNDH a enregistré également des allégations de menaces, d'injures, d'incitation à la haine et à la violence contre certains hommes de médias et autres acteurs de la vie publique. À titre d'illustration, récemment, il y a eu une correspondance de mise en demeure contre un organe de presse, une mise en demeure qui n'est pas forcément justifiée. La liberté d'expression est également limitée par l'autocensure. Cette autocensure vaut aussi pour les citoyens qui, pour certaines opinions ou prises de position, peuvent se retrouver sous mandat de dépôt sur invocation d'infractions en lien avec la cybercriminalité ou la corruption. Le rétrécissement de l'espace civique et politique est constatable. L'inquiétante problématique de la question des engins explosifs également en lien avec le terrorisme. La question des violations des droits de l'homme et des difficultés d'enquête y afférentes. Et il faut noter à ce niveau que les organisations de défense des droits de l'homme ont été interdites de missions d'enquête sur certaines parties du territoire, ce qui constitue un recul naturellement. Et les organisations de défense des droits de l'homme, y compris la division des droits de l'homme de la MINUSMA, n'échappent pas à cette entrave à la liberté de mouvement, d'enquête et de monitoring. Et des entraves ont été constatées également par rapport au mécanisme national de prévention de la torture qui est interdit d'accès à certains lieux de privation de liberté. En matière de droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, il faut noter que des écoles sont fermées, des centres de santé également à cause du terrorisme. Pour en venir aux recommandations, nous recommandons à l'État du Mali de parachever le processus d'adoption des textes de révision du Code pénal et du Code de procédure pénale, du Code militaire également, de diligenter le processus de retour à l'ordre constitutionnel en privilégiant l'inclusivité et renforcer les moyens matériels et opérationnels des forces de défense et de sécurité en matière de droits de l'homme et droit international humanitaire.
Merci beaucoup.
Je vous en prie, merci.
Nous avons votre déclaration. Je suis rapporteur du Mali. Je connais les recommandations faites. Nous allons suivre avec vous ensemble. Burkina Faso National Human Rights Commission, M. Yemboado Khalifa Rodrigue. Le président, il est là?
Ok, merci, c'est moi.
3 minutes, madame.
Monsieur le Président, honorable commissaire, distingués délégués, tout protocole respecté, permettez-moi dès l'entame de mon propos d'exprimer ma gratitude et celle de notre institution à la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples pour l'opportunité offerte à la Commission nationale des droits humains de Burkina Faso de prendre la parole. Il faut noter que la Commission existe dans le paysage institutionnel depuis 2001, mais elle a été rendue conforme aux principes de Paris depuis mars 2016 et en mars 2021, la loi a conféré le mandat du mécanisme national de prévention de la torture à la Commission. La période couverte par l'intervention a été caractérisée par la persistance des attaques terroristes qui continuent d'engendrer de graves atteintes aux droits humains, notamment de nombreuses pertes en vies humaines, la destruction des biens et le déplacement massif des populations. Le nombre de personnes déplacées internes au Burkina Faso à la date du 30 mars est de 1 719 332 personnes déplacées internes. En réaction à ces attaques terroristes, le Burkina a engagé des opérations de sécurisation du territoire
qui donnent parfois lieu à des allégations de violation des droits humains telles que des exécutions extrajudiciaires et des disparitions forcées. La Commission a mené des investigations sur ces allégations sur la base de saisine des organisations de défense des droits humains et sur autosaisine. Des rapports d'investigation assortis de recommandations ont été adressés aux autorités compétentes. Par ailleurs, la Commission note l'adoption d'une loi d'habilitation sur les cas d'assujection liés à la défense nationale. La Commission, ayant pris part au débat parlementaire, a soulevé son inquiétude sur l'imprécision de la notion de sujétion liée à la défense nationale et à l'absence de dispositions imposant que ces mesures soient conformes aux engagements internationaux. Relativement à la situation politique du Burkina Faso, elle s'est dégradée en 2022. À cet effet, à l'espace de 8 mois, le pays a connu 2 coups d'État et le dernier en date du 30 septembre. Toutefois, la Commission salue le rétablissement de la Commission de la Constitution, l'adoption de la Charte et la désignation d'un Premier ministre. Il a ainsi pu présenter ses derniers rapports également devant le Comité de protection des droits des travailleurs migrants et des membres des familles lors de la 34e session. La CNDH note également le rétrécissement de l'espace civique. Les déclarations de manifestations et des marches meetings déposées auprès des autorités communales ont été purement et simplement interdites. Dans un communiqué en date du 30 septembre, il a procédé à la suspension des activités politiques et des organisations de la société civile sur toute l'étendue du territoire. Monsieur le Président, distingués délégués, la Commission formule les recommandations suivantes. Poursuivre les actions de lutte contre le terrorisme dans le strict respect du droit international des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire. Renforcer la prise en charge des personnes déplacées internes. Poursuivre la sécurisation du territoire pour faciliter le retour des personnes déplacées internes, ainsi que la réouverture des établissements scolaires et les autres services sociaux de base. Mettre tout en œuvre pour un retour rapide à un ordre constitutionnel. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Nous allons maintenant Burundi National Human Rights Commission. Monsieur Simplice Bigirimana, Burundi, vous êtes là? Le Burundi n'est pas prêt.
Monsieur le Président, en votre titre et qualité, le Burundi s'est engagé dans la lutte contre l'impunité, en témoignent les décisions de justice déjà rendues pour punir sans distinction aucune les coupables. Les cas récents ont été signalés entre autres à Bujumbura, Gitega, Luyigi, et Makamba. La récente restructuration du Conseil supérieur de la magistrature est aussi une preuve irréfutable de la volonté du gouvernement burundais d'assurer une justice équitable. Les réformes en cours pour lutter contre la corruption, privilégier les compétences dans l'attribution des responsabilités en instituant ceux qui ont démérité, asseoir en état de droit et une justice équitable pour tous sont non seulement une preuve de la volonté politique du Burundi pour avancer les droits de l'homme, mais ils méritent le soutien de la communauté internationale car ils contribuent dans la mise en application des recommandations de l'examen périodique universel 2018 que le Burundi a accepté et qu'il est en train de mettre en œuvre. En ce qui concerne la CNDH du Burundi, elle a été réaccréditée au statut A en 2021 et ne ménage aucun effort pour accomplir sa triple mission de protection, promotion et rôle consultatif auprès du gouvernement. Nous profitons de l'occasion pour réitérer nos remerciements au gouvernement du Burundi qui, depuis 2019, a augmenté d'environ 3 fois le budget alloué à la Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme. Nous remercions aussi les autres partenaires au développement pour les appuis multiformes qu'ils apportent à la CNDH. Beaucoup cours de la période sous observation, la CNDH du Burundi a mené plus de 300 visites des cachots, grâce auxquelles 724 personnes ont été remises en liberté. 18 visites ont été effectuées dans les prisons où 44 dossiers ont fait l'objet de régularisation par les instances judiciaires suite au plaidoyer de la CNDH. Notons aussi que 104 dossiers font encore l'objet de suivi par la CNDH, dont 27 ont été soumis au ministère de la Justice. Bien que des efforts aient été fournis par les instances habilitées pour améliorer les droits de l'homme au Burundi, il persiste quelques cas isolés qu'il faut continuer à suivre. Dans le domaine de la justice, la population carcérale reste inquiétante car malgré la récente grâce présidentielle, nous continuons à remarquer une population carcérale dans certains lieux de détention. En ce qui est des desks, la carence pendant plusieurs jours de certains produits de première nécessité, dont le carburant, les engrais chimiques, le sucre, a négativement affecté la jouissance des citoyens de leurs droits. Nous nous réjouissons que le gouvernement ait mis en place des stratégies pour faire face à ces situations et que pour le moment, ces produits sont disponibles sur le marché. Comme recommandation, la CNDH du Burundi encourage le gouvernement du Burundi à poursuivre et redoubler d'efforts dans la lutte contre l'impunité et juguler la corruption dans tous les secteurs de la vie du pays. La CNDH demande à la communauté internationale d'apprécier et soutenir les efforts du Burundi en général de la CNDH en particulier pour une cause commune d'amélioration de la situation des droits dans le pays. La CNDH, de statut A, est plus que jamais engagée pour accomplir pleinement sa mission. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Nous allons maintenant appeler Nigeria National Human Rights Commission, Chief Tony Ojukwu San. Il est là? Nigeria. Il n'est pas là. Je vais appeler Sierra Leone National Human Rights Commission. Sierra Leone National Human Rights Commission. Commissioner Patricia Marsunda Nemma, Chairperson. Sierra Leone. Il n'est pas là. On passe. Tanzania National Human Rights Commission. Baltazar. Mr. Baltazar.
Asante Mheshimiwa Mwenyekiti.
3 minutes.
Honorable Chairperson, all protocol observed. On behalf of the Commission, I wish to thank you for this opportunity, and I will straight go to the issues that concerns the improvement or the development of the human rights in Tanzania. And the Commission for Human Rights, our Commission, has noted the positive steps in the human rights sector by raising the accessibility, the standards of education. The move by state to the state pregnant girls and young mothers back to school, as well as the erection of more schools building while simultaneously increasing the number of teachers, is very commendable. Of recent, the state has ventured into strengthening vocational education in the country. For example, the government has invested 100 billion Tanzanian shillings to construct vocational training centers in every district in the country. This move will ensure the imparting of vocational knowledge in different fields to the youth for self-employment and hence curb the problem of employment in the country. Further, the state, while the Tanzania Education Fund is working on the project to improve physical infrastructure of primary schools, secondary schools, and colleges in Tanzania as well as Zanzibar. The project will cover the construction of 99 classrooms, 792 latrine pits, 10 laboratories, 52 houses for staff, teachers, and 10 dormitories. The project will also cover 6 schools of children with special needs, whereby 10 will be for classroom, 40 for latrine pits, and 2 dormitories will be constructed. Honorable Chair, the Commission
Commission also reviews the progress made by the state as far as right development is concerned. For example, major projects are underway in the sector of agriculture, communication, energy, health, as well as transportation. The outcome of these projects intends to serve the individual citizens by enabling them to enjoy their rights fairly and equally, to take on board all social groups in the whole concept of development. The state requires all the local government authorities at the municipal and city levels to allocate 10% of their revenue collections in the financial empowerment of youth, whereby the 10% is divided in 4% for youth, 4% for women, and the
very most important one.
Yes. They are all important.
Choose one.
Okay. The state, it is called that the state should ensure that the law enforcers who violate human rights are being held accountable. For instance, the state should consider the formation of an independent police oversight body. This should also result to collaborate efforts to increase public awareness in other issues such as sexual violence and
Merci.
Merci, thank you so much.
Nous appelons maintenant Gambia National Human Rights Commission, M. Emmanuel Diouf, le chairperson. Gambia, la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme de la Gambie. Madame qui arrive. Est-ce qu'on peut lui donner un micro? There is a mic there. Please come here. Yeah, in front. There is no mic there. The first desk here. Even there. Thank you. 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, Chairperson and Commissioners of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, State Delegates, INEC allies, and citizens present. I wish to deliver this statement on behalf of the National Human Rights Commission of the Gambia. Following the end of the operations of the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, the TRRC, which was established to investigate and establish an impartial historical record of the nature, causes, and extent of violations and abuses of human rights committed during the period July 1994 to July 2017, and submission of its report to the President in November 2021. The government on 25th May 2022 released its white paper on the report of the TRRC. In the white paper, which sets out the position of the government on the TRRC, recommendations and findings, the government stated that out of the 265 recommendations issued on 16 teams covered by the Commission, only 2 recommendations were outrightly rejected, with the rest accepted to varying degrees. The white paper was received with wide public acclaim, and we commend the government for its transparency in making the report accessible to all stakeholders, immediately following its release. Since then, the government has taken some steps to implement the recommendations, such as the suspension of 22 individuals adversely mentioned in the TRRC report. It has also indicated a commitment to prosecute those that bear the greatest responsibility for human rights violations and abuses, and the setting up of a special prosecutor's office under the Ministry of Justice. In light of the foregoing, we encourage the government to release its much-awaited implementation plan on the white paper and the prosecutorial strategy. These documents, when released, will go a long way to manage public expectations on the implementation process and allay any fears victims and victim-led organizations may have about the political will to implement the recommendations. On summarized version of some of the negative human rights developments from April 2022 to October 2022, one, we have no number of women in public offices. As referred to in our statement during the 73rd session of the Commission, the Gambia in recent months held successful presidential and legislative elections. However, the successful nature of these landmark events blinds the number of women currently holding public offices. Presently, all three arms of government are headed by men and only 2 women occupy ministerial positions. In the legislature of the 58 lawmakers, only 5 are women, 3 of whom are elected and 2 nominated by the President. Also, there is a diminished financial allocation to the National Human Rights Commission of the Gambia. From the commencement of its operation in 2019 to the end of 2021, the NHRC had received reasonable funding from the government for the implementation of its programs and activities. However, since the start of this year, financial allocations to the Commission to support operations have been dwindling monthly. Organizers of industrial action on state media. In September 2022, the Director General of the state broadcaster Gambia Radio and Jet Television Services instructed staff to not grant coverage to organizers of industrial actions in all sectors.
Madam, thank you very much. You're finished, 3 minutes. Thank you very much. Soudan National Human Rights Commission, Nala El-Sir Sali, le directeur des relations internationales et du management. Soudan National Human Rights Commission. Sudan. Sudan.
Yes. نعم سيد الرئيس، أنا اسمي رفعت الأمين رئيس المفوضية. أشكرك ويطيب لي أن أهنئكم سيد الرئيس والسيدة نائبة الرئيس والسيدات والسادة المفوضات والمفوضين بانعقاد هذه الدورة الناجحة، وسوف أباشر مباشرة في الموضوع وسأكون مختصرا. ترحب المفوضية القومية لحقوق الإنسان بإصدار رئيس مجلس السيادة لمرسوم أنهى بموجبه حالة الطوارئ في جميع أنحاء البلاد، وقد ترتب على ذلك العودة إلى التدابير الدستورية والقانونية المعتادة. كما ترحب بإطلاق سراح جميع المعتقلين السياسيين في البلاد، وإذ نرحب بهذه الخطوة فإننا نوصي دائما بأن يطلق سراح الأشخاص المحتجزين في السجون السودانية على خلفية تهم جنائية أو أن يقدموا للمحاكمات العادلة بدون إبطاء. ترحب المفوضية القومية لحقوق الإنسان بتشكيل لجان للتحقيق في جرائم القتل والإصابات ومزاعم الاعتداءات الجنسية التي تعرض لها بعض المتظاهرين أثناء ممارستهم بحقهم في التجمع السلمي، ومع ذلك فإننا نطالب بسرعة إكمال هذه التحقيقات ونشر خلاصاتها للجمهور وبتقديم جميع الأشخاص المشتبه في تورطهم بارتكاب هذه الجرائم للمحاكمات العادلة بأسرع ما تيسر. ونؤكد دائما على أن الإفلات من العقاب من شأنه تعزيز إمكانية تكرار هذه الانتهاكات، وإذ نرحب بتصريحات المسؤولين وتعهدهم بضمان الحق في التجمع السلمي، فإننا نطالب باتخاذ تدابير فعلية مستمرة لحماية المتظاهرين من العنف ومن جميع أشكال التدخلات غير القانونية التي من شأنها إعاقة إعمال الحق في التجمع السلمي. وإذ ترحب المفوضية القومية في انتخاب السودان لعضوية مجلس حقوق الإنسان، فإننا نطالب الحكومة السودانية بتنفيذ تعهداتها الطوعية في مجال حقوق الإنسان وتنفيذها للتوصيات الواردة إليها من جميع هيئات حقوق الإنسان الإقليمية والدولية، كما نشجع الحكومة على تنفيذ تعهداتها بإكمال المسابقة على اتفاقية القضاء على جميع أشكال التمييز ضد المرأة وبروتوكول مابوتو، كما نحثها على المسابقة على اتفاقية حقوق العمال المهاجرين وأفراد أسرهم وجميع المعاهدات الإقليمية والدولية الأخرى التي لم يسابق عليها السودان، كما نحثها على التفاعل مع جميع الآليات الإقليمية والدولية. إننا نلاحظ تماما لخطاب الكراهية ونلاحظ أن آثار إثارة والخطورة بمكان، ونعمل مع جميع أصحاب المصلحة في السودان على أن نحث الحكومة على تغيير القوانين وإصدار تشريع شامل يجرم خطاب الكراهية وأشكال التعصب والعنصرية، وأيضا معالجة المناهج الدراسية
بما يتوافق مع الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان والميثاق الإفريقي لحقوق الإنسان والشعوب والمعاهدات الإقليمية والدولية ذات الصلة. تؤكد المفوضية القومية لحقوق الإنسان على أهمية دور المجتمع المدني وضمان استقلاله، وتوصي الدولة دائما بضمان استقلاله ودعمه للقيام بدوره في مجال ونشر ثقافة حقوق الإنسان. وتلاحظ المفوضية القومية لحقوق الإنسان باستمرار المشكلات المرتبطة بالحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية، وقد تفاقمت هذه المشكلة بعد إجراءات 25 من أكتوبر وما ترتب عليها من تدابير اتخذتها الصناديق المانحة من الشؤون الدوليين، وهذه التدابير أثرت على الفئات الأكثر هشاشة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
شكرا جزيلا سيد الرئيس. On va passer à Malawi National Human Rights Commission. Malawi. C'est le dernier INDH que j'ai. Malawi.
Thank you, Chair.
You are there. You have 3 minutes.
Yeah. The Malawi Human Rights Commission commends the Malawi government for amending the land laws and the Corrupt Practices Act, and also for initiating the process of amending the Prison Act, Penal Code Act, and the Disability Act. Also, we have also seen the opening up of the civic space, allow Malawians demonstrate their rights, and also to establish the establishment of the Special Investigation Unit through the Malawi Prison Service to investigate cases of persons with albinism. However, there's been quite a number of challenges in the full enjoyment of human rights. And in that regard, the Commission makes the following recommendations to the Malawi government: expedite the review and approval of the National Plan of Action on the promotion and protection of human rights, support to the Malawi prison to address issues of overcrowding and shortages of food, strengthening operationalization of the Access to Information Act and Gender Equality Act, strengthening the mechanisms for fighting corruption, which is still very rampant in Malawi, procurement of adequate, stocking issues to the hospitals, since most of our hospitals right now have got stockouts. And also, finally, the Commission continues to call upon the appointment of the Special Envoy on Albinism to ensure the implementation of the Plan of Action as committed through the African Union Plan of Action to end attacks on persons with albinism. Thank you, Chair.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons demander aux INDH suivantes, si elles viennent, qu'elles se manifestent. C'est les INDH du Cameroun, du Nigeria et du Sierra Leone. Je vais maintenant passer à la liste des ONG. Je vais appeler le Center for Reproductive Rights. Est-ce que vous êtes là? Non. Je vais appeler... Yeah. Yes. Vous avez 3 minutes pour faire votre déclaration. Pendant ce temps, j'appelle l'Africa Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies de Anna Foster. Je crois que la déclaration sera lue par Nadji. Comme ça, on ne perd pas le temps de route. Nadji, vous approchez du micro. You have 3 minutes. You can go. You can go.
Honorable Chairperson and Commissioners and esteemed guests, all protocols observed, I'd like to make this statement on behalf of the Center for Reproductive Rights, Observer Status number 358. The Center for Reproductive Rights is grateful for the opportunity to make this statement, highlighting the situation of women and girls in Africa with regards to the realization of their sexual and reproductive health and rights. We would like to congratulate the Commission on convening this session and on the 35th anniversary of the Charter. We acknowledge the Commission's commitment to ensuring that the right to health, including sexual and reproductive health, is recognized and safeguarded by state parties, as is evidenced by the launch of the General Comment on Regulating Private Actors in the Provision of Social Services, which is envisioned to take place during this session, and we have just witnessed. These developments at the regional level contrast sharply with the regressive measures that have been witnessed in numerous state parties. For instance, in Rwanda in February 2022, the Supreme Court refused to recognize the discriminatory and therefore unconstitutional nature of a domestic law which limits access to legal abortion care by allowing only doctors and gynecologists to provide such services. This is inconsistent with best practice as established by WHO, which has found that mid-level healthcare providers with sufficient training can provide safe and quality abortion care. It's also unresponsive to the realities in Rwanda, where the doctor-to-patient ratio is 0.12 to 1,000 doctors, which is far lower than the recommended doctor-to-patient ratio of 1 to 1,000 doctors. Additionally, in July 2022, without adequate or meaningful public participation of rights holders and civil society, the state of Kenya adopted the Reproductive Health Policy 2022 to 2032. This policy includes various regressive provisions, such as defining reproductive rights as entitlements that accrue to couples instead of to individuals, and subsequently focusing on ensuring access to sexual and reproductive services and information only for married persons. The policy also fails to provide for access to safe legal abortion, a constitutionally recognized reproductive right in Kenya. Also, in July 2022, after public outcry that was sparked by widespread misinformation campaigns, the government of Lagos State in Nigeria withdrew its state guidelines, which provided crucial guidance to health providers on how they can provide safe and legal abortion care to the full extent of the law. Honorable Commission, these examples demonstrate successful, concerted, and organized efforts to get governments on the continent to actively take measures that hinder the enjoyment of the best attainable standard of health, including reproductive health, as also envisioned in the Maputo Protocol. Although targeted at access to safe and legal abortion, these efforts are resulted in actions that are also impeding access to maternal health and contraception. Thus, we would like to call on the Commission to take notice of these regressive trends and put in place measures to defend the progress that has been made in realizing the rights entrenched in the Maputo Protocol. We would also like to call on the Commission to continue to urge all state parties to prioritize the universal of available. I'm wrapping up, Chair. This is the last sentence.
Yes, give your one sentence.
All right. So, in conclusion, we would also like to call on the Commission acceptable and quality sexual and reproductive health information and services, especially relating to maternal health care, contraception, and comprehensive abortion care. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies de Anna Foster Nadji Moulay. Vous allez faire la déclaration 3 minutes, si vous pouvez respecter le temps. Merci.
Thank you so much, Honorable. Honorable Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Honorable Vice President of the African Commission, Honorable Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. At the time when we are celebrating the 73rd session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and despite the significant progress made on several issues, civil, political, economic, and socio-cultural levels, and despite the procedures, treaties, and other mechanisms put in place for the protection and promotion of human rights, it is regrettable to note that in some countries, crime of intellecticide are being orchestrated against persons who are the support of universal cultural and values. During the recent election in some African countries, there have been threats, action of terrorism group, intimidation of citizens, gross violation of human rights, and the disturbing frequency of the use of terror to terrorize an individual or group of individuals. On behalf of the African Center for Democracy and Human Rights Study, we call on for an urgent need for the reflection on the issue of security and the respect for human rights, including the respect of human rights defenders. Appropriate measures, therefore, have to be taken to prevent and combat human rights violation. Among these measures, the African Center recommends that the African Commission on Human People's Rights should make the digitalization of human rights advocacy a crucial role. It is therefore important to focus on human rights in the digital area. Many human rights defenders have in the past and continue to pay with their lives as many others are imprisoned and go into exile in search of safety and freedom. Of course, digitalization bring with it new challenges for democratic system and institution. Political parties, states, organizations, and especially companies now hold remarkable, powerful information about us as we witness data collection on an industrial scale. More and more aspects of our lives are being stored, monitored, and used online for good or bad. On closer inspection, all of us who have come here today have a smartphone and on it have left a digital footprint leading straight to this room. The value of digital technology from development and human rights perspective is enormous. We can connect and communicate around the world like never before through the internet. We can facilitate, disseminate information, empowerment, and the establishment of investigate process. We can now use satellite imagery, encrypted communication, and data stream to defend, promote human rights. We can even use artificial intelligence to predict and stop human rights violation. Honorable Commissioners, at the African Center, we see that in addition to this real danger, there are unprecedented risks to the right of privacy. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Nadji. Nous appelons IPAS Africa Alliance. Eric Munja, Policy Advisor. Pendant ce temps, SAFEN Africa Litigation Center se prépare. SAFEN Africa Litigation Center se prépare. You have the floor, sir, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Honorable Chairperson, Honorable Commissioners, distinguished state representatives, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols duly and respectfully observed. We recognize the important role the ACHPR plays in protecting the rights of all persons living in Africa. IPAS commends the effort of the Commission and that of individual honorable commissioners who have sacrificed their time, resources to engage with various civil society organizations in raising awareness on protection of human rights, as well as putting out statements to assert this important message. Despite many years of campaigns in Africa and the world for the right to safe and legal abortion, the continued criminalization of abortion harms thousands of women every year, especially young women. This situation is often grounded in colonial laws that have never been abolished and are supported by anti-women government policies, politicians, judges, and religious leaders. With the poorest and most marginalized women and girls worst affected, this restricted access not only to safe abortion, but also to other sexual reproductive health care services, including pregnancy and delivery care. Maternal deaths have risen substantially in some places alongside violence against women. The Maputo Protocol is a living document that should continue to be translated into domestic laws and programs to ensure that women and girls enjoy the rights provided in the protocol. Many challenges persist that hinder women and girls from attaining their full rights. These include, among others, entrenched cultural practices, exclusionary economic system, law and lack of support for women candidates in politics and public life. While celebrating the great achievements of the Maputo Protocol, which provides for bodily autonomy of women and girls across Africa, that has brought the human rights agenda, it is also recognized that more action is needed to guarantee women and girls have full enjoyment of their rights. Criminal laws on abortion are discriminatory and enforced disproportionately and impact mostly the vulnerable women and girls. Those are poor families living in rural settings, lack of education, and the high risk of police investigation, arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment for unsafe abortion. Pushing women and girls to unsafe abortion, often delayed to seek treatment at public hospitals and clinics with adverse effect to their lives. Criminal abortion violates many basic human rights, including right to life, liberty, security, health, freedom from torture. Criminal abortion laws discriminate based on sex. They penalize a health service only women need. In conclusion, Honorable Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, we call upon the Commission to, one, call all EU member states to decriminalize abortion in line with the campaign launched in 2016. Two, all EU member states that have not yet ratified the Maputo Protocol to do so and also domesticate. Lastly, to intensify their efforts to ensure full realization of women's rights, increasing allocation of resources. We thank you very much.
Nous allons appeler maintenant Open Society, Ibrahima Khan. Open Society, Ibrahima Khan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, je vais, au cours de cette session sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Afrique, m'appesantir sur la situation en Tunisie. Et je vais lire le texte qui est en anglais parce que mes collègues tunisiens sont déjà rentrés. Tunisian democracy is under imminent threat of authoritarianism. Your Excellencies, honorable member of the African Commission on Human People's Rights, distinguished participants, as we speak, Tunisian human rights activists are being arrested, awaiting trial for expressing their opinion and exercising their fundamental right to protest. You may be aware the 25th of July 2021 was a turning point for the fragile democracy in Tunisia since President Kais Saied illegally immaculate and end the functioning of democratic institutions of the country. He confiscated state mandates, abrogated powers to himself by controlling the legislative, executive, and judicial power that govern the country. Tunisia ratified the African Charter on Democracy, Election and Governance, which forbids such political practice, resulting in an unconstitutional change of government. This cannot be accepted by the AU under its legal framework. As a pretext to handle the COVID-19 crisis, President Saied declared a state of emergency, which was extended to the end of 2022. He further dismissed the Prime Minister and issued Decree number 117, giving himself the authority to rule by decree. President Saied then dissolved the parliament and most of the constitutional institutions that could oppose the autocratic system he created, which continues to evolve into the machinery of arbitrariness and tyranny. Political parties and civil society organizations were also attacked by President Saied. He accused them of treason and corruption, fueling public sentiment against all intermediary bodies while restricting freedom of expression and association in the country. President Saied used presidential decrees to eliminate institutions that didn't support his authoritarian project, such as the Judicial Council and the Electoral Commission. He ordered the drafting of a new constitution and ensured that all relevant stakeholders, including civil society and political parties, were excluded from participating in the process. When the constitution was adopted through a national referendum, 70% or 6 million out of the 9 million of eligible voters refused to participate in the process.
One recommendation, the very best one.
Okay.
Very big one.
I have just few recommendations for the Commission to demand that Tunisia restore the representative, participatory, and inclusive democracy, implement the decision of the African Court on Human and People's Rights that declared the Decree 117 and all other decrees passed by President Saied as null and void, put an end to human rights violations happening in Tunisia, and urge President Saied and his administration he leads to refrain from using military court to try political opposition and civil society activists.
Merci.
Then we call on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights back an urgent mission to Tunisia to install dialogue with all the stakeholders in order to assist them with the restoration of democracy and human rights in the country. I thank you for your attention, Mr. President.
J'appelle la Fédération internationale de l'action des chrétiens pour l'abolition de la torture FIACAT, Bon Wine Dadley, responsable du programme. Ils sont là? Si vous pouvez faire un peu rapidement, vu le temps qui est en train de partir comme du vent.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, chaque jour, l'Afrique devient le prochain continent abolitionniste. Plus de 3/4 des États de l'Union africaine sont abolitionnistes, en droit ou en pratique. Le 27 juin 2022, le président de la République centrafricaine a promulgué la loi portant abolition de la peine de mort. En septembre dernier, la Guinée équatoriale devenait le 25e État africain à abolir la peine de mort. En outre, l'actualité laisse présager que le corps abolitionniste se renforcera très prochainement, puisqu'un projet de loi au Libéria et une proposition de loi au Ghana sont devant leurs parlements respectifs. Malgré ces avancées, quelques reculs sont à déplorer. La FIACAT dénonce les nombreuses condamnations à mort en République démocratique du Congo, dont 51 prononcées en janvier 2022 par le tribunal militaire de Kananga. Plus encore, le dépôt d'une proposition de loi portant autorisation d'exécution de la peine de mort à l'Assemblée nationale en mai 2022 laisse présager un terrifiant retour en arrière. Notre organisation encourage les autorités à inscrire au plus vite, à l'ordre du jour de la prochaine session parlementaire, la proposition de loi portant abolition mentionnée par le ministre des Droits humains en mars 2022 devant les Nations Unies. Enfin, au Niger, la FIACAT regrette les 4 condamnations à mort prononcées par les autorités judiciaires nigériennes. En janvier et mai 2022 à Dosso et Tilaberi, et appelle l'État nigérien, en collaboration avec la société civile, à profiter de l'actuel processus de refonte des codes pénals et de procédure pénale pour abolir la peine de mort. Monsieur le Président, la FIACAT souhaiterait dénoncer les graves violations des droits humains au Burundi. En dépit de la volonté de calme affichée par le chef de l'État, de juin 2020 à août 2022, la CAT Burundi a dénombré 671 personnes arrêtées arbitrairement et 180 personnes torturées. Plus encore, l'ONG Ensemble pour le soutien des défenseurs des droits humains en danger a documenté 13 cas de torture dans les cachots du service national de renseignement en juin. La FIACAT demande à la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples de diligenter une mission au Burundi afin de constater la situation actuelle des droits humains dans le pays. Monsieur le Président, la FIACAT souhaiterait vous faire part de ses préoccupations quant aux actions de l'Agence nationale de renseignement NRA en République démocratique du Congo. Alors même que le chef de l'État congolais avait promis, dès sa campagne électorale, de former tous les cachots de l'agence sur l'ensemble du territoire, ceux-ci demeurent actifs. De nombreux opposants politiques, défenseurs des droits humains ou journalistes, détenus.
Merci. Vous avez dépassé le temps. Il faut toujours regarder les choses. Parce que...
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
J'ai l'impression que je suis le seul à monitorer les temps de parole. Center for Education and Awareness. Center for Education and Awareness. Education and Awareness. Vous êtes là? Yes. 3 minutes. 2 minutes, please.
Yep. Honorable Chairperson of the Commission and Commissioners, Center for Rights Education and Awareness would like to address the human rights status of women and girls in Kenya. Would specifically like to highlight the following: addressing the equal participation of women in the political life of the country. Kenya just concluded its general election, which has seen the country record an increased number of women. Even with this, the representation of women in Kenya, Parliament, Senate, and Assembly continue to be minimal and below the 2/3 principle as espoused in the Constitution of Kenya. We call upon the Commission to call upon the state to immediately honor the multiple judgments of the courts and implement judicial directives towards putting in place legislation and policy for the achievement of the two-thirds principle in Parliament and Cabinet. We would also like to call the Commission to the attention of the National Reproductive Health Policy 2020 to 2023 that has just been adopted by the country. The policy contains various provisions that claw back on the constitutional guarantee on the right and life, or to the right of life and right to reproductive health. It further denies critical reproductive health care intervention to the majority of women and girls. Women below the age of 21 are not guaranteed the access to reproductive health care on the basis of not attained full cognitive competence on matters of sexuality before the age of 21. We call upon the Commission to call upon the state to immediately retract the whole policy and put in place a national reproductive policy that is inclusive and reflects the lived realities of women and girls in Kenya, to uphold the access to affordable and quality SRH services, and to finally alignment of laws and policies on sexual reproductive health. Lastly, we call upon the Commission and draw attention to the numerous reports of human rights violation that Kenyan women are facing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia due to the lack of protection of women from torture, sexual violence, and mistreatment by employers. Kenyan migrants, both skilled and unskilled, continue to transcend borders in search of better employment. Data of the number of Kenyan migrants to the Gulf region remains scanty. However, about approximately 80,000 Kenyans live and work in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with majority serving as domestic workers. We have noted numerous distress calls from the migrant workers, majority being women of various age groups seeking for reparations, as well as victims of torture, sexual abuse, and limitation of movement and association. The Kenyan government has not been responsive to the distress calls. We immediately call upon that the country should be able to get all the individuals and to also put a ban on migrant workers. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame. SOS Jim, Bahati Rubango. SOS Jim. Vous êtes là? Dépêchez-vous, s'il vous plaît. Bahati Rubango. Ensuite, j'appelle Fiakat Cameroun, parce que je vois deux Fiakat ici. Bissey Maxime. Fiakat Cameroun. Non, ben vous ne pouvez pas faire deux fois. Vous avez déjà fait.
Madame le Président, Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles et Messieurs les commissaires, nous saluons la collaboration qui existe entre la RDC et la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples, ainsi que la volonté du gouvernement congolais à mettre en place un fonds de réparation des victimes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit et les victimes de crimes contre la paix et la sécurité de l'humanité. Nous rappelons que plusieurs parties de la République démocratique du Congo, notamment les provinces de l'Est, le Kasaï ainsi que le Kwango, continuent de faire objet de violations graves du droit international public et du droit international humanitaire. Nous demeurons convaincus que pour mettre fin à ce cycle de violence et nuit, il est impératif que les auteurs matériels et intellectuels soient punis et que les victimes de cette tragédie humaine accèdent aux réparations individuelles et collectives et que ce processus de vérité et de réconciliation soit déclenché et que les véritables réformes institutionnelles et judiciaires sécuritaires s'en suivent. Tel est le combat du prix Nobel de la paix, Dr Denis Mukwege, qui demande de manière incessante la mise en œuvre des recommandations issues du projet du rapport mapping des Nations Unies. Il y a lieu également de faire un peu que les défenseurs des droits de l'homme, les dénonciateurs et lanceurs d'alerte, les journalistes, ainsi que les activistes pro-démocratie qui dénoncent au quotidien les génocides des Congolais pour les gains économiques génocostes, ne sont pas à l'abri des menaces, des arrestations arbitraires, des intimidations, l'exil forcé, voire l'assassinat. Au regard de ce qui précède, notons que la restauration de la paix n'est possible en RDC qu'à travers la mise en place de mécanismes de justice transitionnelle et l'adoption de textes protégeant de manière effective les défenseurs des droits humains engagés au quotidien pour l'émergence du pays. C'est pourquoi nous exhortons le Parlement congolais à adopter une loi nationale pour la protection des défenseurs des droits de l'homme et des journalistes, conformément aux standards internationaux. En même temps, nous demandons à la RDC et à l'Union africaine, c'est entendu la Commission, de déclencher le mécanisme de justice transitionnelle pour l'établissement d'un tribunal pénal international pour le Congo, ou alors les chambres mixtes spécialisées pouvant juger les auteurs présumés de crimes graves commis en RDC et de donner le droit aux victimes d'accéder à la justice, à la vérité, aux réparations adéquates et aux garanties de non-répétition. C'est cela qui freinera toute personne qui tenterait de continuer à alimenter les groupes armés.
Merci.
Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Nous appelons maintenant la FIDH. Rapidement, c'est M. Idriss Abamba. Vous êtes de la Côte d'Ivoire, c'est vous qui allez lire pour la FIDH.
Honorable commissaire, la FIDH célèbre en ce moment à Paris son centenaire et donc le doyen Mabassa Fall m'a commis pour la lecture de la déclaration que je fais maintenant.
Il vous reste 2 minutes 55. Allez-y.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les commissaires, la Fédération internationale pour les droits humains a suivi avec beaucoup de préoccupation l'évolution de la situation des droits humains en Afrique et souhaite s'adresser à vous sur 3 points cruciaux, à savoir les graves déficits de gouvernance liés à des conflits durables et à l'augmentation continue des prises de pouvoir non démocratiques et anticonstitutionnelles, le rétrécissement accru de l'espace civique, la répression de la liberté d'expression et d'association sur le continent et l'absence d'obligation de rendre des comptes pour les graves violations des droits humains commises sur le continent. La FIDH salue les progrès accomplis dans la lutte contre l'impunité des auteurs des crimes les plus graves qui se traduisent par l'ouverture d'enquêtes et de poursuites par les juridictions nationales et notamment le premier procès devant le tribunal pénal spécial en République centrafricaine et aussi pour l'ouverture du procès pour le massacre du 28 septembre en République de Guinée. La FIDH note également avec satisfaction la libération d'Ibrahim Esdin, de Rami Saad, de Hamid Sami Satawi, de Mohamed Ramadan, de Patrick Georges Zaki, tous qui étaient détenus en Égypte. Toutefois, la FIDH est profondément préoccupée par le déclin continu de la gouvernance démocratique et la montée des prises de pouvoir par les gouvernements militaires. Et là, nous regardons du côté du Burkina Faso, du Tchad, de la Guinée, du Mali et du Soudan. La FIDH est aussi préoccupée par le rétrécissement de l'espace civique politique. Là où les gouvernements de transition sont en place, mesdames et messieurs, l'on observe une restriction accrue de l'espace démocratique. Et pour cela, regardons du côté du Tchad, du Djibouti, de l'Algérie, de Guinée, pour ce qui est du grand chapitre des rétrécissements de l'espace civique politique. Mesdames et messieurs, la FIDH est aussi préoccupée par l'absence de responsabilité pour les violations graves des droits humains et les abus commis à l'encontre des civils. La Fédération internationale des ligues des droits de l'homme reste profondément préoccupée par l'impunité rampante dans de nombreuses situations où des crimes graves et des violations des droits humains sont commis. Sur ce, nous recommandons ce qui suit. La Fédération demande à la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples d'exhorter les États africains à assurer un retour définitif à la gouvernance constitutionnelle par le biais d'un régime civil dans tous les États actuellement en transition et cesser les États injustifiés dans la convocation d'élections démocratiques. Cesser immédiatement la répression, les violations des droits humains commises contre les citoyens et citoyennes, les défenseurs et défenseurs des droits de l'homme partout. Initier rapidement des enquêtes indépendantes et impartiales sur les allégations de violations des droits humains.
Merci, FIDH, pour votre déclaration.
Merci.
On va donner la parole maintenant à Defenders, Walda Chaka ou Joseph Pikanda, l'un des deux. Vous êtes là? Walda Chaka, voilà. Vous pouvez... La plupart de ces gens, j'en ai pas sur la liste. C'est de mémoire que j'ai. Mais si tu commences, tu dois être perdu.
Au protocols observed, on behalf of defenders and African defenders, we join the rest of the African community to celebrate the 35 years of growth and milestone achievements of the African Commission. For this reason, we've supported 27 human rights defenders from across the continent to join this celebration and engage with the Commission. Honorable Chairperson, this celebration takes place as, in contrast, we continue to record spikes of violence, repression against human rights defenders and armed conflicts that obstruct the achievement of justice and accountability. Despite impressive efforts to strengthen the Commission's framework for the past 35 years, it is disturbing to see the lack of political will by states to implement the Commission's recommendations and totally disregard the obligations under the African Charter. We remember vividly, in a few examples, Egypt ignored the call by this August
the government reported at least 50 deaths and more than 300 injured. The Commission should call for prompt in 2021, the UNHCR reported that the Eastern Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region hosted 4.9 million refugees and asylum seekers, as well as 12 million internally displaced people. Yet regrettably, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia remain the biggest epicenters of conflicts on the continent. We call on the Commission to condemn ongoing violations and abuses, government's repression and obstruction to justice, and the transitional justice process in Sudan and South Sudan. Honorable Chairperson, while reflecting on climate changes and the protection of the environment, we deplore some direct threats by African governments against HRDs working on the issues of climate justice. In this regard, we hope that the COP27 that will take place on our continent, specifically in Egypt, may build on successes and pave the way for future ambition to effectively tackle the global challenge on climate change. However, I would like to emphasize that there is no climate change without an open civic space. We therefore urge the Egyptian authorities to immediately lift restrictions imposed on numerous NGOs, release of unjustly detained human rights defenders, as well as ensure that activists attending COP27 are not obstructed by prohibitive administrative processes or other undue restrictions of their rights. Honorable Chairperson, the recrudescence of coup d'etat in Africa has contributed to weakening the democratic order and the rule of law through escalation of conflicts, climate shocks, chronic vulnerabilities, marred by endemic poverty. Chad, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Sudan are still under the de facto authority of unelected military juntas, while Tunisia is on its way back to the era of dictatorship, threatening to eliminate gains of the revolution. Swaziland and Zimbabwe continue to repress, suppress human rights defenders and curtail fundamental freedoms with impunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tanzania Human Rights Defenders Coalition. Tanzania. A Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights se prépare, mais je crois que Global a déjà parlé. Tanzania Human Rights.
Yes. Your Excellency, Honorable Chair of the African Commission, all protocols observed. On behalf of Tanzania Human Rights Defenders Coalition, allow me to start by congratulating this commission and the government of Tanzania for opening up civic space, democracy, and strategic engagement with the human rights defenders and reformation of the criminal justice in Tanzania. Honorable Chairperson, regardless of this positive progress, we have recorded a few incidents of human rights violation and rule of law in Tanzania, whereby human rights defenders' rights, political rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and criminal justice have been violated. For instance, between January and October 2022, a total of 53 human rights defenders have been supported by THRDC, whose rights were violated. Among them, 13 were journalists and 3 of them were charged with criminal offenses. Almost all media outlets were informed, restricted by the official sources to cover the ongoing incidents of Ngorongoro and the Loliondo crisis, while media houses were fined. About 10 journalists were arrested and threatened, when attempting to cover community meeting in Ngorongoro. Honorable Chairperson, the most unbearable and ongoing human rights situation in Tanzania relates to eviction of Maasai in Ngorongoro and Loliondo, which this commission also provided a statement. We appreciate the proactiveness of the commission and the UN special mandate on this matter. The government of Tanzania has forcefully demarcated 14 villages, land covering 1,500 square kilometers of Maasai land. Human rights defenders in Maasai communities did not support the demarcation process. They stood up to defend their rights, and at the middle of this community process, some of the villagers and HRDs were supported to have been beaten and detained and denied the police for medical access while thousands crossed the border to neighboring countries for human rights support.
Thank you.